All right, this is Unit 4, Group 7's video assessment. My name is Brendan Davis.
I'm Ryan Smith.
I'm Kristen Della Garza.
Yeah, I'm Nick Dinkins.
I'm Maddie Hazard, and our animal that we created, our imaginary animal, is the honey panda. It's a mix between a red panda and a badger. Its habitat, it lives in the Appalachian Mountains, which can be concluded would be Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and the Carolinas. It's an omnivore, so it eats plants, berries, snakes, birds, fish, mostly small little creatures. Its main predators are bears, foxes, and people that hunt it for its fur mostly, because it's a nice golden color. The abundance of this animal right now is not much. There's 1,000 left in the Appalachian Mountains due to habitat loss from lumber and coal companies, as well as poaching. And the reproduction is kind of like a red panda. The mammal only breeds once a year, and it normally has 2 babies, but normally only one will survive.
All right, so as far as its journey with the ESA, we're starting off with listing. So in recent decades, the honey panda lost a lot of its natural habitat in the Appalachian mountain range due to lumber harvesting and mountaintop coal removal, just like Maddie was talking about. A lot of the members of like small communities in the Appalachian range kind of relied on these animals to hunt for food and to sell the pelts. So when those community members noticed the population's decline, the Appalachian Trappers Association submitted a petition to have the honey panda protected by the ESA. So once the proposal was reviewed, the ESA looked it over, and after about a year, the honey panda was added to the list of endangered species. So the next step that we've got going is the designation of critical habitat. As we said, most of the habitat loss has been at the hands of lumber and coal companies. So in response, the ESA designated 300, or the Fish and Wildlife Department designated 300 miles of protected land across 3 different sites in Tennessee, West Virginia, and Kentucky. So they have 3 different reserves of 100 miles each in those states. For incidental take permitting, a lumber company called the Tennessee Trees and Trunks has acquired a 20 square mile patch of land in Tennessee that they're looking to do logging in so that a development company can move in and build a small community there. The land that they purchased was found to have a small population of honey badgers or honey pandas on it. So the company will apply through the state government and receive an incidental take permit, which as they apply to do this, that'll begin the process of creating a habitat conservation plan. So the habitat conservation plan for this specific company is going to involve leaving more trees than they would have. Originally, the company was planning to take about 90% of the trees out of the area so that they have enough space for development. That number got reduced to about 70%. And a lot of the spaces that are being cleared had to be a little more spread out to allow for natural patches of forest in between for the honey pandas to continue living there. And then after the lumber company has done all of its work there, the development company that is actually building the community will also have to go through the same process of getting an incidental take permit and building a habitat conservation plan. A lot of their part of the habitat conservation plan will probably include planting patches of indigenous trees in and around the community to make sure that they're not completely removing the honey panda's habitat.
Yeah, I think you summed up those steps pretty well. So following the habitat conservation plans in the ESA, the next step is usually conservation banking, some kind of strategy, which essentially is an agreement between the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, landowners, and developers. And so typically in these kind of agreements, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services approves a number of land use credits that the landowners can then sell to developers in exchange for landowners' protection and management of that habitat. So because the designated habitat for the honey panda was declared around the Appalachian Mountain Range, like Brendan was talking about, a lot of coal companies and timber companies want to use this land because it's very, very profitable for them. Although this kind of why the honey panda became listed in the first place is because of the environmental destruction by these companies, the coal companies can still purchase and use this land because of the nature of conservation banking. So in this step, essentially we found a private landowner in Tennessee who owns 1,000 acres of land in the designated habitat area. So he owned that land before it became designated for the honey panda. Because that land is rich, coal and timber, the coal company wanted to reach out to the landowner and the Fish and Wildlife Service and attempt to purchase the land use credits that will allow them to mine on the land. So the Fish and Wildlife Service and the landowner agreed to that request, and they granted the landowner land use credits to sell 150 acres of the land in exchange to use that money that they're getting from the coal company to pay for habitat restoration on the remaining 850 acres of land. So all parties agree to sell some of the land for development, although before the coal company can actually start using that land and developing on it, they are required by the Endangered Species Act to establish a plan to compensate for any effects or damages that will inevitably be caused by the mining practices. And so in order to abide by that, the coal company agrees to purchase another 50 acres of private land elsewhere, where they will relocate some of the honey pandas and establish measures that help breeding and getting the species numbers back up. So after the conservation banking, the next step in the ESA is usually a recovery plan. So a few months after the coal company purchased the land use credits and helped establish the conservation bank, the Fish and Wildlife created a recovery plan for the honey panda with the goal of eventually getting them delisted. So a recovery plan is basically a long-term plan. Sometimes it can be as long as 50 to 100 years. That's made by a government agency to help restore the population numbers and eventually get the honey panda off the Endangered Species Act. So in the recovery plan, the Fish and Wildlife Service decided that more land along the Appalachian Trail should be declared as designated habitat for the honey panda because new research indicated that the species have migrated a little bit closer to coal mining operations in the region, and the species numbers are starting to go down. So in this plan, nobody is allowed to be on that land or be close to anywhere near the animals without receiving really large fines. And on top of declaring more land for the honey pandas, in the recovery plan, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife plans to establish a reproduction conservatory where mating pairs of pandas living in those at-risk areas can be taken and monitored, where reproduction can be encouraged. So also in the recovery plan, that plan needs to be reassessed every couple of years for maximum success. And so the Fish and Wildlife plans to do that by evaluating the number of honey pandas living in those areas each month. We'll make adjustments based on the numbers of the panda species. And so the next step after that is the reauthorization and appropriation step. And so in order for the Endangered Species Act to really remain intact and active, it has to be reauthorized every 5 years so that when new members of Congress come in, they can reassess it and revise it in any way that it needs to be. So but even though if the ESA is not reauthorized, it still remains in place. So, even though this is the case, it's still the responsibility of Congress to allocate money for the ESA, or else it won't be able to accomplish any of its goals. So in this case, the honey panda species numbers were increasing for a while, but 1 year Congress decided to appropriate much less money to the ESA, and therefore there wasn't as much money going into the protection and conservation as previous years. And so the species numbers started to slowly decline. But following year, the ESA saw this, and Congress saw this, The ESA was set to be reauthorized, so Congress decided to allocate more money back into the Endangered Species Act. And on top of that, they also decided to make some more specific changes. Because the reproduction conservatory and conservation banking practices had not been very successful in restoring the species numbers, Congress decided that less incidental take permits for the honey panda should be allowed, and that more land should be designated as habitat for the honey panda, which that aggravated a lot of the coal companies who have continued to use those incidental take permits to, mine on that land. And so, this is led to a lot of problems, which leads us into the next step, which is the God Squad.
I would like to point out before the God Squad start, part of the recovery plan was also the breeding pairs, like Ryan said. San Diego Zoo has gotten several pairs, and they are also part of the recovery plan.
Yes, I forgot to mention that. Thank you for
Sorry,
adding
Kristen.
that.
Yeah, I did like your recovery plan that it included stuff for the long term, like you said, since they're supposed to be about 50 to 100 years in span. I think like a lot of the steps with the honey panda has just been giving it more territory. I like that you kind of took that a step further and made some actual plans to start recovering numbers.
And with the God Squad, if the numbers aren't recovering, and if something gets more serious in terms of like the population of honey pandas declining, and especially if it's rapidly on private property, and the people who own the property are making it worse for the species, the God Squad will get involved so that they can get certain permits exempt from private landowners and companies. And the God Squad is like a high level cabinet members, and there's 7 of them. And they're all like within the ESA. And in this case, the lumber company wanted an expansion project, but this was going to be into more of the honey panda territory. And the God Squad voted no. And even if the God Squad votes no, that's not always safe. There's still the threat of it being overridden by another bill in the government, like in the case with the snails and the dam. The God Squad voted no for the building of the dam, but another government entity voted that it should be done. And once the dam was built, the snail numbers did rapidly decline. But these cabinet members voted no on expansion because they found that this specific project for expansion would destroy the species and its habitat. And the vote was unanimous, but they only needed 5 out of 7 members to vote in favor of it. And this decision was not undermined by the government, like in the case of the snails, and the honey panda numbers remained consistent because their habitat was not destroyed. And another step in the conservation policy is no surprises policy. And this is a policy agreement between the private owner and the conservationist to let the landowner know everything that is and will be happening within the environment over a long period of time. And during this course of time, the lumber company has continued to expand, and they discovered a burrow of honey pandas. And that was not within the agreement. But they found that the best method of conserving the population would be to relocate the honey pandas. And this falls under the no surprises policy because relocating the honey pandas wasn't part of the lumber company's initial agreement. And because of this, the government will be responsible for moving the honey pandas to a new area. That responsibility financially is not going to fall on any private owner. And the lumber company and any other private owner within this will not have to pay to rebuild or expand or relocate the territory for the honey pandas because under the no surprises policy, that's just not within their responsibility. And then the next one, the next step would be like the safe harbor policy, which Nick is going to get into.
Yeah, that was a really good way of explaining it, Kristen. And going on to the safe harbor policy, it would be where the Fish and Wildlife Service has reached out to the landowner in Tennessee. Basically, it makes sure that he can protect the honey pandas and make sure that they are hospitable and habitable. He would allow like future takes if the population grows larger or above a certain number or level, just depending. And the agreement can also allow the land to change if the landowner allows it in the long run for the honey pandas so that they can repopulate. But it just depends on whether or not they are naturally inclined to increase or decrease. based on how they repopulate. And then the next step would be delisting. And the honey panda has thrived in Tennessee and the Carolinas, but has been falling in Kentucky and Virginia because it's the states with the coal mining, with the most coal mining. Hunting is now somewhat permitted again in Tennessee and North Carolina, but not in others. Some confusion with hunting has arisen in in which states. It just depends on each individual state's regulations, climate, weather, and other environmental factors in a certain region. Because the chances are the honey panda is not necessarily the same in two opposite regions. It all depends on adaptation and each population within a region. And an issue that can arise with delisting is it would be if like the honey pandas are taken off the list for killing or hunting. It means that like you cannot hunt for the fun of it, but it also depends on the certain locations. If it may be more naturally inclined for the numbers to drop, but ways to help are to set limits on how many can be hunted. If that's the case, many could be able to bid on a hunt in order to keep the land and population in its natural state or very similar to it.
I really liked how you tackled the safe harbor policy, mentioning how like the landowner might be allowed to take a certain number of the honey pandas once their numbers get to like a stable spot again. It really reminded me of like the trophy movie documentary that we had to watch with the rhino rancher like arguing to let him sell some of the rhino horns. I know initially we had set the precedent that the honey panda's fur was like a valuable commodity. So if he could potentially take like a few each year and sell the furs to help fund their conservation, I think that's a very accurate like real life scenario that we've already seen examples of.
I agree, definitely.
Yeah, especially since it's a mammal, and we talked about how that's more of a problem, and it's more popular with mammals in particular compared to like reptiles or amphibians and stuff like that. And on our next section, we're going to talk about and describe the challenges to measuring and defining biodiversity, and how this makes the task of saving biodiversity kind of like difficult, because everybody has their own definition. Everybody has their own,
There's
facts.
two sides.
Yeah, there's a lot of sides to all of it. And the first one is the idea of instrumental value versus intrinsic value, because this shows how people can think of it as two different ways. And this kind of goes back to the mammal issue with delisting, because, with endangered species, people are more likely to want to save the ones that are like cute or give us value, rather than something like a smaller animal or something we don't really care about or think is cute. And the instrumental value is the value that is desired, like specifically by humans. I know in class we had the example of like a poisonous snake or venomous snake, sorry. And it was endangered, but people didn't really want to save it because, oh, it's scary, it's a snake, like it doesn't do anything for us. But the instrumental value in that was that snake venom actually could be used for medicine, and it is used in a lot of medicine. So for that reason, we value that aspect of it. And that's what makes it instrumental, is something that is valuable to humans. So that's why we want to save it. And intrinsic value is the idea, like in terms of the honey panda, it was valuable in itself because it's a living entity that's part of an ecosystem. So therefore it should be valuable. And those are two issues that come across a lot in the attempt to save biodiversity, whatever that means. And then there's also the idea of richness and evenness. And richness is a way that diversity can be described, and it's how many species there are in an environment. It can be equal, low, or high in terms of comparison to other ecosystems. So there can be like within a forest, there can be 10 different species, but that's like might be really low to another ecosystem. And with evenness, this is another way to describe how diversity can be measured. And a high evenness means that there's high diversity, and vice versa. Like evenness is more of the ratio, and richness is the number of species within a given area. But Yeah, so those are two problems that we come across in trying to save diversity.
Yeah, so like our honey panda would have low in both, because
Hmm.
very low, I think you said the richness is the number, so obviously that's low, they're endangered. And the evenness, as we talked about earlier in all the policies, it is more common in Tennessee, they've been thriving more in Tennessee, so then I guess it had high evenness there
Yeah, higher evenness in Tennessee
and
than
low in others.
Yeah,
Would-
and like
Wouldn't they
Nick
be high in richness? Because richness is the number of species.
Yeah.
If they have a bunch of species and they would be that area.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I keep getting mixed up.
Yeah, see, there's a problem with trying to say biodiversity. People, it's different. So yeah.
And I also really liked how you explained the instrumental and intrinsic value in terms of like how like something like a snake might be poisonous or venomous, but it might help save someone else in terms of medicine. Um, yeah, that was a really good example.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was a really good analogy, especially how you briefly talked about how humans are really quick to like personify other animals, kind of, and like give them value based on how much they're like us. Like everyone loves dogs. Obviously, dogs are kind of like us. Smile, whatever. You can look at a face and it's like, oh, it's like kind of similar to a human face versus like a snake. It's really creepy and big teeth. It's just a good way to describe it. So.
I liked that you pointed out that a lot of the times, like how we judge animals in that, like with those two classifications, is their value to humans. But I think it's worth noting that like a lot of the species that we see that are like most important and need to be saved, probably more than some others, are ones that have like absolutely no value to humans, but play like a bigger role in their ecosystem. A lot of like the animals that people tend to like not like insects or like bats or like things that just kind of bug humans are actually really important to the functioning of the ecosystem. So I think
It
that's
also makes me go back to the trophy video,
Mhm.
how like rhinos don't really have much environmental impact. They do, they actually do though. It's not how they did it all in the movie, but like to people wise, they provide nothing to us.
Yeah.
So it's like the large side is like, why should we save them? What are they doing for us? And it's like, but it's a rhino.
Yeah.
We gotta save the rhino.
The value is just the fact that people like looking at it, like it's
Yeah.
cool to inhabit the planet with another, species, with another big, really majestic kind of animal. But yeah, no, I think you really did a good job, Kristen, of showing how there can be a lot of different definitions of biodiversity and a lot of different opinions on which animals to protect or prioritize protection versus others, which kind of leads into different types of diversity. So the first type of diversity we'll talk about is alpha diversity, which alpha diversity kind of refers to diversity on a really small scale or local level, and typically refers to the size of like one ecosystem, and essentially is like the number of abundance of species within a given habitat. So example of this, let's just take like 100 acres of land somewhere and say that there are 80 bison, 20 deer, and 10 elk. That would be the alpha diversity of that. And then you go into beta diversity, which is comparing the biodiversity on a little bit of a larger level. So it would be the comparison between two communities or ecosystems. So back to the first example, let's call that 100 acres that I was just talking about site one. So site one, 100 acres, 80 bison, 20 deer, 10 elk. Let's say that there's another 100 acres of land adjacent to it. Let's call that site two. And they find the same thing. There's 80 bison, 20 deer, and 10 elk. So because the number of species are the same between those two different sites, there'd be low diversity, low turnover rate. On the other hand, if the site two contained, let's say 20 bison, 30 deer, and 30 elk, then the beta diversity between the two regions would be high because there is a significant change in the number and abundance in the species between site one and site two. Continuing to get a little bit bigger, you go into gamma diversity, which gamma diversity refers to diversity on a large scale and is essentially the level of species diversity compared between many ecosystems. So this could include like a whole slope of a mountain, like the whole area of a seashore, just very many ecosystems. So following along with the previous examples, gamma, beta diversity, or alpha diversity just would refer to the single 100 acres of land. Beta diversity would be 200 acres of land, and gamma diversity would refer to like many 100-acre lands. Yeah, so the next type of diversity kind of goes the opposite direction. It's a little bit smaller, less inclusive. Taxonomic diversity, which kind of refers to the specifications and small differences that separate different species from one another. So taxonomy is like describing, categorizing, and naming different living things. And so the smallest order of taxonomy that you can measure is the species. It gets larger from there. You know, groups of species make up a genus, groups of genuses make up a family. You know, that keeps getting bigger, bigger. It goes kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. I don't know how I remember that from like freshman year of biology. But basically, yeah, so it just shows that the level of biodiversity increases with each higher level of taxonomy because the more species it consists of. Which this can also be a little problematic because, you know, like we were talking about before, if your goal is to save and protect biodiversity, it might be a little difficult to, you know, kind of define, and people can have varying definitions about, you know, species and their importance in terms of protecting them. You know, for example, there can be a variety of ways to define a species, as we'll get into in a minute. And you know, if you have to make a decision between protecting the most biodiverse group of species, I guess, you know, you'd be faced with a decision to, well, see if you want to protect 10 families consisting of 200 species or 20 families consisting of 100 species. It just kind of goes to show that oftentimes there's not really a shared consensus on levels of biodiversity and, you know, what species or habitats are more biodiverse, and, you know, if those should be protected and prioritized over others.
Really like that. How do you think that this would challenge the measuring of biodiversity? Like, I know you went into how it challenges like what we define as biodiversity, but what do you think about the measurement? Do you think that that poses any challenges?
The measurement, I mean, I think there was one example, I can't remember exactly what it was through the slides, but I believe it was about spiders, about how there was a consensus. I could be totally wrong, but there was a group of, or a genus of spiders, or a species of spiders, I'm not sure, but they essentially realized that there was more spiders in the group of genus or family, and so it now led to the discovery that that was more biodiverse. And so I think just with more time and, you know, better studies, better research, we'll be able to determine, you know, a clear line of what this species is versus another species. And
Yeah, where you were trying to go to the spider thing, yeah, it was California spider, and it ended up being 6 different spiders.
Yeah, that's
what they all classified as one.
And then there was the one with the fish, the blue marlin, and then the one that looked exactly like it, but it was completely different. So it's hard to like measure how many there are because it's, they're
right.
not the same.
Yeah, that was really interesting seeing that example because, you know, I have an uncle who fishes down in Florida, and, you know, and occasionally they'll go, you know, make a trip to the Bahamas and go white marlin. That's like his big thing. But yeah, I had no idea that there was another like fish like that, and they looked really similar too, which was interesting to me.
In the slides that he showed us, I could not see any difference.
I saw no difference. I saw no difference in the fish.
I like that you mentioned how like that can be a problem in like the environmental community itself, because like a lot of the other issues we see to protecting species, especially like as we're going through the steps of the ESA up there, like a lot of it is foreign bodies and like politics and stuff getting in the way of conservation, but like conservationists can also get in the way of conservation depending on whether they want to like find like all the finite details that split families apart, or whether they just want to lump them all into one big group.
Right.
It affects how the policy is going to take hold on the community, but those distinctions are like really common, and I feel like there are a lot of issues that arise because of it.
Definitely.
And going off of what Ryan said about the like certain like the marlin and the fish like looking really similar, it kind of goes into these next three, the biological species concept, the more morphological and the phylogenetic. With the biological species concept, basically species can interbreed freely and create like a viable offspring under natural conditions, meaning that like you see it happen kind of all the time in nature. The most common one I feel like when you think of it is like a mule, which is basically, you don't really know it, it's a mixture between a horse and a donkey. But it's critical to create a healthy offspring. And like one crucial thing to know about this concept is location. Like biologically, if a certain animal is only native to one area, no evolutionary change kind of will happen. So like if all your donkeys are only in like one area or like all your horses are, then that mule's always probably going to be like relatively the same. Um, and with the morphological species concept, um, basically what it is the physical appearance or the phenotype of an organism basically determines its taxonomy identity. It differs from the biological concept though, like based on the appearance of the animal, kind of like with the fish or the spiders. It differs. It doesn't look at DNA, rather it like looks at kind of like fossils is like an example. Like it relies entirely on morphology, which is the physical structures or traits of an organism. Um, which is the nice thing about a fossil is it captures a moment of what a certain type of like an ape was, and or how it has changed physically, added or lost features, and like the changes of shape and size over time and more. Lastly, the phylogenetic species concept is relatedness and identity is determined by shared common ancestry, or relatedness by or which is like relatedness is identified by the change in DNA, and our phenotypes like allow the phylogeny to be mapped. Like if you think of a Siberian Husky, for example, or like any dog breed, it kind of branches off similar in ways, just because of like looks. If like you look at like a Husky compared to a wolf, they're very similar DNA wise. It just really depends what they all have in common and like the characteristics in which they share, which is why it is important to know how like animals have evolved into different species, hence kind of like the theory of evolution.
Like the slides, how his example of the giraffes, how all the giraffes in Africa actually came from like one, and then all the different environmental splits, and now it's like 5 different giraffes.
Yeah,
You can kind of tell by the spots, but yeah.
yeah, I think it was really cool how they changed like just slightly with like the patterns of their spots and the colors. I didn't know that. I thought that was pretty cool.
I thought there was one type of giraffe. I didn't know. I didn't know that there
Yeah,
were
I
like.
didn't know either. I thought it was just giraffes and giraffes, but
Yeah.
Yeah, I like all of those concepts that you just went over, just kind of like highlight everything that we said in the section before that of like there's these two groups of scientists and conservationists that want to like just look at the surface level, like all these look the same, they function the same, it's all one species, but they want to like get in there and split the hairs by looking at like the actual genetics of them and like still can't really decide which one of those is better for the actual conservation efforts. But that is very closely related to these next 3 types of diversity. All of these are ways of measuring diversity. I think more of like a species or group of animals itself. I think the earlier types of diversity we were talking that Ryan was talking about earlier, like the alpha, beta, and gamma, those are more like relating the diversity of a ecosystem. I think from what I understand, these are more focusing on like the animals themselves. So the first type is genetic diversity. And genetic diversity looks at like the actual genetic makeup of an animal in an attempt to classify it. So they look at markers like nucleotides, genes, alleles, proteins, like the smallest particles that make up these animals to try to find differences between them. And that's like an example of the people that are really trying to split hairs and like find all those different species of giraffe, instead just trying to lump them together. The other type of diversity here is phylogenetic, and it is like the studying of the family tree of a species or a type of animal. It really focuses on small differences between the different types of animals to like pinpoint where they branched off of the main group evolutionary or evolution wise. When we studied this in class, Professor Stallings used an example of two islands, where one island has many types of different species that have all recently split off of their kind of shared ancestry to have like minor physical differences. And the other island has many of the older, like historic types of that species that branched off from the main group long time ago. And when I heard that, it immediately made me think of Darwin's finches in the Galapagos, where he's studying all the slight differences in like the beaks and all that, tails, depending on like what part of the island the finches live on, but they all shared a common ancestry. It's kind of a prime example of studying phylogenetic diversity. And then the last type of diversity here is functional. And that is very much like I was saying earlier, like the people that just want to look at the surface level of the species and classify it instead of going into all those details. Functional diversity basically focuses on the actual role that the organism plays in its ecosystem. So it doesn't really care about morphological or genetic differences. It just looks at if they like fill the same niche in an ecosystem, they'll kind of be lumped together in this form of studying diversity. So it's kind of a more practical, real world approach to calculating the diversity of an area by just looking at what they do for the ecosystem.
Yeah, I think you described those types of diversity really well. I liked what you were saying about the phylogenetic diversity, and you used the example of Darwin's finches. I thought that was pretty cool. For one of my classes last year, I think it was Bio 155. I'm sure you guys might have had to take that. I don't know if that's required. But yeah, one of the projects that we had to do was we looked at the phylogenetic tree of, I don't know which genus of tree it was. I think it was the birch tree, the oak tree. But basically, we had to look at each of the leaves and the acorns for each type of tree and like construct the tree based on like how those have like changed and evolved over time. And it was just really cool to see like how just a slight environmental change can, change, like you were saying, the size of the beak, color of the beak on a bird, or versus like, this shape of leaf, it's like, skinny and longer, like short and kind of fat. I just think it's really cool. There's so many different ways you could,
Absolutely.
split out a genus or species.
What I have also realized in these last two topics of lumpers and splitters and taxonomic anarchy is Darwin comes into play, obviously, like he was for all of it. And also, a lot of these end up tying together, like in lumpers and splitters, phylogenetic diversity, phylogenetic species concept and biological species concept come into a massive play with how they split. So in lumpers and splitters, in which groups of animals, plants are either lumped together to make a bigger group, or because they're very similar characteristics, like phylogenetics, or they're split apart because they technically are not the same. They have those slight differences, like the marlin, blue marlin, spear. I still don't know what the other one's name is.
I think it was
because they're not the same. So like from the slides and everything, it went into explaining Darwin's friend Hooker, who was different from normal taxonomists. The normals, they were very with lumping, keep it simple. We don't want much. But then Hooker was very like, no, we need each of them. And it started with the British flora. There was like 17 different ones. He's like, keep them as 17. And then going into taxonomic anarchy, the lumpers and splitters actually either helps or lessens an animal's chance for money. It also lessens or helps the vulnerability. If you split it too fine, the animal's going to die out because you split it to the point where there's only like 4 breeding pairs, and you're like, the odds of that surviving are not too high. Whereas if you lump it, you now have 100 breeding pairs. Can easily go, which is why Mammalian taxonomists use phylogenetic more, which is the shared common ancestries, kind of like the giraffes. So you group all the giraffes together, while birds tend to use the biological species ones of the interbreeding. You can interbreed, have an offspring that can also reproduce, which tends to help the mammalian ones more because obviously you get all the groups together, you get more money, a lot more money, versus the birds. You're keeping the individual groups and it's going to be a little hard to overlook and give money to each specific one. So, but yeah, using that, you tend to have like mammals are more take our money, and birds are so sad.
Yeah, I really like that you remembered like the distinctions in the scientific community, how like mammalians like to use the phylogenetic system more and like lump them all together. I like, as we've been learning all of these, basically the like biggest thing that stuck out to me was like, depending on the circumstances, it can be really good to split hairs and it can be really good to lump together. Like it's kind of different for every case and for every animal. And I think that's like really difficult for conservationists to try to make the call on which one is right for a certain situation. But you did a very good job of summing that up. I think it was a very good description.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree. I think we like all, even though they're all like very similar, we did really good at like describing the different like almost characteristics of each one.
And I think like going off of what you said, Brendan, about how it makes it difficult for conservationists, I feel like these concepts also make it difficult like for awareness. Cause like I know like
Mhm.
when I was younger, I'd always be like, oh, save the bears or whatever. And it's like, okay, well, there's all these different types, there's all these different issues. Why do you value them? And it's kind of the awareness is a little bit off, and like the conservationists and the public aren't always on the same page. And it makes things like very difficult. And I think that we can see that through these concepts a lot.
Seems like it really is dependent on like a case by case basis too, for what the species is, where it is. Like you're talking about, Maddie, what kind of diversity you want to look at, phylogenetic, genetic, functional. There's just so many different parts that go into it. And so I think it makes the conversation really difficult.
Also, like what I was thinking about with the fish and how like the phenotype difference and all of the different ones, it's also super hard to look at it considering when you first look at them, you can't tell. So you need someone that knows each to tell you. So like that's definitely hard for normal fishermen, normal people that just want to go catch a fish and they're like, do I have an endangered fish or am I just catching a fish?
Yeah.
It's hard to bring awareness to every single animal that's either endangered or not.
The best option scientifically isn't always the best practically, like in real life.
That's what.
Yeah, I agree.
Well put.
All right, well, great discussion, guys.
Yeah, I think they went well.